Ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is with the incredible and the incredibly unique Dr. Nanci Guest. Dr. Guest is a registered dietitian. She's a personal trainer, as well as a strength and conditioning coach to elite athletes and everyday athletes alike. She has served as Canada's head dietitian for the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, as well as the 2015 Pan American Games. She has also prepared athletes for the last 4 Olympics in London, Sochi, Rio, and Pyeong Chang. Dr. Guest has an illustrious research career which culminated with the 2019 Dr. Michael C. Archer Award for Research Excellence, and I cannot understate how amazing that is to actually receive. Congratulations, Nanci. That wasn't that long ago that she actually received that. This podcast is all about one of Nanci's areas of expertise, which is caffeine and performance for athletes, in particular in an ultramarathon situation. Ultra runners are in this really unique proposition where we can use caffeine for acute performances for workouts. We can use caffeine to stay awake and alert during the wee hours of the morning for those overnight ultras. And we can also use caffeine to stave off fatigue for those long runs or for ultra marathons. And those are all very unique propositions, which Nanci and I talk about throughout the course of this podcast. I had a lot of fun with this. Nanci is an awesome follow on Twitter. The links to that will be in the show notes. Go give her a follow on Twitter. You will not be disappointed. But for right now, I'm going to step out of the way. Here's my podcast with Nanci Guest, all about caffeine and performance. So I actually forgot about this. How did you get so kind of like wrapped up in caffeine in the first place? Because this is like one of your many things that we were talking about before we started recording. Like caffeine just seems to be one of those things. How did you get involved in it in the first place?
Yeah, so where that came about, working with athletes, obviously, and just active people, caffeine is well known to sort of give you a little boost, and most of us, of course, do enjoy our morning cup of coffee, and most of us have those pleasurable effects. But where I became more serious in looking at the research was because I found with my own athletes I worked with, not everybody was getting a performance enhancement from caffeine. So there seemed to be some inter-individual variability just in my practice. And of course, there have been a number of studies written on caffeine, and I had read several of them, but it wasn't consistent that every study showed a benefit. And what became more apparent after I started my PhD was, as I looked more closely, we rarely see individual raw data being presented. And we just see the overall effect that the outcome on average, there was no effect of caffeine or there was an effect. And because my lab looks at the research is in nutrigenomics, so nutrient gene interactions, this is where I sort of thought perhaps the same thing is going on as we see in the caffeine research with regard to heart disease, that depending on your genetics, you may have a risk of high blood pressure or heart attack. And if you have a certain variant, there may be a protective effect. So this sort of brought me to the potential realization that this may be happening in the sport sciences as well, where we're seeing different responses to caffeine through differences genetically in the metabolism of caffeine. And so that's where I embarked on this journey to see if caffeine, in fact, was the response was modified based on your genotype in certain genes that we look at that have been known to affect caffeine metabolism and response.
And we're going to go over that genetic
Sure.
difference in just a second. I've almost felt that over the years, you and I have been practicing for a similar amount of time, that caffeine and altitude have kind of followed the same trajectory where, and I've talked about this on this podcast before, the listeners will remember a little bit of this dialogue, where it wasn't that long ago, maybe 7 or 12 years ago, where the de facto thing to do was to go and do an altitude camp. We thought everybody responded positively to it. All the elite athletes were doing it, live high, train low. There were altitude symposiums and conferences and things like that. And then as the practice kind of got more and more nuanced, we started to notice that not everybody responded, and we're taking a little bit more of a cautious look at it. Now, the reasons for that difference and that individual difference in response is not solely related to genetics on the altitude side of things, but caffeine
Yeah,
has kind of followed a similar pattern where,
yeah,
I mean, you remember especially in the late '90s with all the cyclists and things like that. I mean, they were downright abusive towards caffeine and caffeine use, and we're starting to filter out a little bit more use of it. Have you seen the same thing with caffeine, to where now we're trying to almost tailor it down a little bit more? But is it really at a genetic level to where that tailoring is most appropriate?
well, you know what I like to say about life in general is there are only two things that are impacting your behavior or your health: genetics and the environment, or the interaction of your genetics and the environment. So basically, almost everything could be traced back to our genetics. So we have not identified all the genes that affect altitude training or caffeine or creatine or our response to various phytonutrients. There's a lot out there that is yet to be discovered, but I do believe that we have enough data showing differences when it comes to feeling jittery or anxious or more energetic, or having more difficulty sleeping. So sleep disturbances are on a spectrum between individuals, among individuals. And then we have the severity of withdrawal effects. And there have been associations to genes. But I think really, when it comes down to an individual, there's going to be some interaction with their past experience, coming from perhaps the habits of their parents, their mother during pregnancy, all the way to how they train, how experienced they are, what their habitual use of caffeine is, and what their choice of the form of caffeine. So there are several factors. And you're right, what we are trying to do is sort of pin it down to give the best personalized and individualized recommendation. And I think we do have to guide our recommendations based on several layers of personalization. And so it's not just about genetics. That's one layer that I provide guidance to my athletes. But there are many other things to consider, just like with general diets. There are many factors that go into what is the best diet for you. And I think the same goes for supplements. And we can get into sort of all those reasons and how I assess an individual of whether they should use caffeine at all. Even if it is providing a benefit, we still may advise, again, on a one-to-one level. I have some athletes that I try to discourage them from too much caffeine use, because I can see the severe response they have to sleep disturbance, and then certain individuals that may be at risk of taking sleep aids, whether over the counter or prescription. So that's sort of an area that needs to be addressed, we can talk about. But I do think people need to be on their individualized caffeine program. And I say that similar to my colleague, Amy Bender, which some of her research will come up, where she talks about athletes being on an individualized sleep program. And I think we need to take all those factors and decide, how are we going to approach caffeine with this athlete?
It's so funny you mentioned that, because I know a lot of athletes out there that are going to use caffeine, particularly in an evening workout, in order to get the ergogenic effect within the workout itself, but they don't realize the effect that it has on sleep afterwards. And it's almost like one up, one down, or one up, two down, maybe. Maybe they get a little bit of boost on the workout and they can reap some benefits from that workout. But then if their sleep and their recovery is impacted, it almost comes out as a wash. Before we get too far into the weeds, into the individualization, and people like you and I, we love to do that, right?
Yeah.
People want to know what are just the general guidelines if they're looking to use caffeine in what I'm going to call a traditional ergogenic way, right? They're going to use it right before a workout or a hard workout or a race in
Yeah.
order to enhance that. And there are lots of studies, partially because it's easy to recruit college kids for two things: alcohol and caffeine. So
Yeah.
we have really robust research on how this actually works. So let's start with that framework. If somebody's going to use caffeine in that traditional ergogenic sense for a workout or a race, what should that look like in terms of dose and timing?
Well, it's an interesting question because we have the practical experience and then we have the research, the published research, and sometimes that doesn't always align. So I sort of wear two hats. I have the researcher hat and then I have the sport dietitian hat. And first of all, I have a very thorough assessment with each athlete I'm going to be working with. So it depends on the sport. So for example, if a training session or a race or a competition, if we're looking at 90 minutes or under, I think probably the most consistent and beneficial approach we see in practice and in the research is to supplement anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes ahead of time. And that is going to be with your traditional 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body mass. Now, where this can differ, we sort of have a bit of latitude with our approach, is some individuals are getting that benefit on a dose as low as 2 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. And I, in my research, wanted to try and identify that dose where we could see that benefit. So we can get into that, the 2 and 4 milligrams. But in my experience, and as far as a lot of the published research, I don't believe we need to go up to that 6 milligrams per kilogram. So I would have an individual start out with the 3 to 4 milligrams. And again, 30 to 60 minutes before they begin that training session or that competition, if it's around 90 minutes. And I think that's the best approach for that time frame. Now, if we're looking for an endurance sport or training session that's lasting longer, so looking at 2 to 3 to 4 hours, all the way up to Ironmans, triathlons, ultra endurance events, then our strategy shifts. And we wouldn't want to start out with such a high dose, but we would look to start out with a smaller dose and then have those intervals of the smaller doses throughout, especially as the athlete starts to fatigue. And I think we do see a consistent benefit physically and cognitively when we give caffeine at a point where fatigue is starting to set in. So I think caffeine may have its strongest benefits when you're starting to get tired. And your listeners will be glad to know that the most consistent benefits we do see with caffeine are in the endurance arena. So the shorter the span of that exercise test or that sport, I think the research gets mixed, but the longer you're training or competing or racing, there seems to be an increase in the chance that you're going to benefit from caffeine. We'll have to consider other factors, but the good news is I would say most endurance athletes will benefit significantly. And I don't mean that necessarily statistically, but have a huge benefit, anywhere from 1, 2, 3, 4%. And that's a big jump.
This conversation is going exactly like I had forethought that it would, where it's just giving us more and more of an excuse to take in more caffeinated products. From an ultra marathon perspective, though, I can almost see three different scenarios. Not to dive down too many rabbit holes, but you're giving them to me, so I'm going to take them.
Yeah.
The first of which is just what you mentioned. It's a workout. I'm going to go and I'm going to do a hard workout. It's less than 90 minutes, and I'm going to take some dose of caffeine 30 to 60 minutes before the session itself. And before we get too far into all of these different scenarios, just to level set things for people, you mentioned this range of, I'm going to give the bigger range, 2 to 4 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. Practically speaking, what does that look like?
Well, that's actually a good question, twofold. That looks like, so for example, for an 80 kilogram male, and I'm accustomed to this just from my research, where we did give the 2 and 4 milligram dose. That's generally 1.5 cups of coffee or 3 cups of coffee. So the 2 milligram was the 1.5, the 4 milligram for that body weight. Now, the caveat there is that having a coffee, let's say you go to your, if we don't want to name names, but one of the most popular retail coffee outlets globally, one day you can go and get your tall brewed coffee that may be 150 milligrams. The next day at the same location, that same tall may be 250 milligrams. So we have that variability, which in my opinion, it means that if I want to be more precise with dosing, I do advise tablets or capsules. And of course, the more elite athlete we have, or in the research, under research circumstances, we need to be exact with those doses. But I do think that that's where we run into some issues with differences in outcomes, is we don't know exactly how much that individual took. So 70 milligrams, for example, is a typical espresso shot. Okay. So having 2 espressos, that's 140 milligrams. Now that's not quite going to reach your 2 milligrams per kilogram for a heavier male, but certainly that reaches it for a 150-pound athlete.
Okay, that puts it in the ballpark. I just wanted
Okay.
ultra runners, we're a pretty extreme lot, right? And
Yeah.
if I'm glad that you mentioned this 6 milligram per kilogram type of threshold, because in absence of that, we're gonna go overboard and
Yeah.
in everything like any other endurance athlete. Okay, so back to my point, we've got these three scenarios, right? We've got the workout
Yeah.
scenario where you're kind of like taking it in advance, right? We have what I'm going to call the long run scenario. And I agree with you that I think that bang for your buck, that's where caffeine is really going to shine through. You're going out there for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, and there's some level of fatigue that's going to be imposed. That's where you can get some big hits from caffeine usage. And then we've got this third scenario that we might have to speculate on a little bit because it's really unique to ultra running, and most of the research is going to be derived from the military on this. And
Of
that
course.
is from a cognitive and a sleep deprivation point of view. A lot of these ultras are going 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours into one night, and maybe over multiple nights. And
Yeah.
ultra runners are going to want to, they don't care about the traditional ergogenic effect in the early part of a race. They care about, hey, I need to be able to stay awake and make good
Yeah.
decisions later.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the kind of like the latter two, as fatigue starts to kind of creep in to an endurance session. You mentioned that caffeine can be kind of like layered in small doses as that starts to happen. What does that look like? Because there's a number of sports nutrition products that athletes can choose from that usually range between 12 and a half to up to 200 milligrams of caffeine per kind of serving size, right?
Units.
Yeah,
Yeah.
unit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does that look like from a practical perspective if we're looking at using caffeine on like a long run or a long type of event?
Well, my first response is always it's individual. The context matters, and it depends on the person. But I would say you certainly don't want to start out with that big hit from the get-go. And hopefully we can get an athlete started with no caffeine, just being well rested,
Right.
well fueled, and start implementing those small doses as you need more fuel. So perhaps when you need that gel, or you need that, in the second or third hour, take a hit of caffeine there. Once you're perhaps at that 8-hour mark, you need a higher dose, and maybe you actually do a 50 milligram tablet or half a tablet. So something interesting is to consider your circadian rhythm. So there's sort of other confounders that are involved in this approach, or knowing what the outcome may be. And so what we've seen in some of the sleep deprivation research is that their circadian rhythm is very influential, and not only on your ability to stay awake, but also your performance. And so one study showed that even at the 30-hour mark, when it was daylight, it was easier for subjects to stay up than it was when at the 24-hour mark, when it was dark. So they were more sleep deprived, but because their body was used to being awake at that daytime, even after missing a whole 24 hours of sleep, they could better handle it. So I think in the evening, so when it's dark, these athletes are probably going to need to pump in the caffeine at perhaps 50 milligrams or more per hour. And I think we do see at the end of some of these events that over a 24-hour period, some athletes are at the 100 to 200 milligrams. Some are up to close to 1,000 milligrams that they've consumed in that time period. So I think knowing when you're starting to drop off and trying to get it just before you sort of get into that beyond the point of no return. But I would say to consider the daylight, also what time you would be eating. And so we're more likely to be awake at meal times. And so to sort of foresee when those are occurring during the event. But when your body is actually going to be winding down and sleeping in regular life in this 24-hour period, that's when you're going to need those hits, probably at the greatest frequency, and that moderate dose, though, 30 to 50 to maybe 70. And I would say through tablets, broken up, or again, if you're needing the fuel as well, through that form.
Through sports nutrition products.
Yeah.
So we're kind of getting into the typical ultramarathon situation, especially 100-mile ultramarathon situation. And there's this phenomenon that's not just in ultra running, but we tend to think it is, and it's called the witching hour. And so typical race start out at 5, 6 a.m. Sometime around 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. And there's actually really good research to draw upon with this, is the highest rate of dropout for any ultra endurance type of event. It's right before that 24-hour period of when they've actually been going. It also happens to coincide when everybody's the drowsiest and the sleepiest.
Yeah.
And knowing this, most ultra runners will want to try to counteract that with something. Sometimes they'll use a pacer to keep them awake. Sometimes they'll use music, and caffeine is one of those substances that they will actually use. But I think there's a lot of confusion to how to actually implement that in real time. What I'm hearing you saying is to roll it in at a slightly lower and smaller doses.
Yeah.
Perhaps in the hours before that time frame.
Yeah, or more frequently. So every 60 to 90 minutes, taking that. It also depends on energy expenditure. So I think if you are, or intensity. So if you're going through, if this is a flat race, or if it's if you're the fatigue is setting in and you have some elevation to conquer, I think perhaps you need to to hit your system with a bit of a higher dose depending on body weight again. So we do see that typical 100 milligrams used as flat cola, for example. We have the research behind that. Now, that's a different hit for someone who weighs 120 pounds versus 180 pounds. So I think if we look at the 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight per 60 to 90 minutes.
That's super
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of, we get into that ballpark. Now, I would not be doing that for a 24-hour period, but if you're saying that witching hour is about 2 to 4 a.m., you said?
Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then there's also going to be another sort of that afternoon sleepiness as we see the adenosine rise. And so that's really what we're trying to counteract in the body is the adenosine, which is that sleepy, calming hormone that gets released in higher amounts throughout the day, and it peaks at bedtime, right? So that's what caffeine does, is it blocks those adenosine receptors. So you can't have that calming effects occur, and you can't have sort of that sleep induction. You are blocking it and causing a stimulating effect in most people. Not all individuals will, in fact, have that effect. So I would look at the smaller doses in anticipation of that 2 to 4 a.m. So perhaps at 10 p.m., start that hourly or every 90 minutes and try to have a wider span through the daylight.
And that's easily achievable with most normal and reasonable caffeine-laced nutrition products, gels or blocks or things like that. If I've always felt that if athletes just switch from the non-caffeinated version of the sports nutrition products they're using to the caffeinated version of the sports nutrition products that they're using at about midnight or something like that, they're going to get themselves in that correct dosage by the time that they actually need it.
Yeah, I would agree. I still do feel nervous about the caffeine concentration and how well that is controlled.
In the product.
Yeah. So we don't have, I mean, of course, we have the evidence for, we do have with pre-workouts and different formulations. Now, if you're looking at something like a gel, I would feel more confident that the milligrams that's on the label is in the product. But unless we're batch testing these products, and I'm sure probably something like Consumer Lab has done this, but I think that's important. And so what I would err on is to break up tablets, so I know for sure what's in it, and just stick with your caffeine-free products. So that is my approach, just to be a little bit more in control.
Yeah.
But I do think that you probably have a very good chance of being, you can be confident that the dose that's on the label is probably true to what you're receiving, if it with an error, maybe plus or minus 10%. But if it's, I mean, I guess this is coming from a perspective of someone working with professional athletes or Olympians, and with regard to our national athletes, for example, we don't even risk it being made at a pharmacy with an encapsulator. We use our own encapsulator to make sure there's no contamination, and the dose is exact through the powder for the need of the body mass of that specific athlete. So the more precision, the better. And especially when you're looking at a substance that you want those performance enhancements, but also where getting too much or too little can either be not allow you to achieve that ergogenic effect, or too much may cause anxiety or other adverse effects. So perhaps if you're in a race where you can sleep for 2 to 4 hours,
Mm-hmm.
or with athletes that are in the playoffs and we want them to be able to sleep, we do want to err on that lower dose. So again, it does depend on that sport, but if we're sort of sticking with that 24-hour time period, I would make that known to the runners that,
Right.
listen, if you really want, if you feel you're sensitive on both sides of it, that you will be too tired if you don't get enough, and you may get a little bit anxious if you get too much. So if you find that you're an individual that needs to be very precise, I would get the caffeine powder and make your own capsules, or certainly some of the tablets I find are reliable, like the no dose or
Yeah.
wake up, that type of thing.
And some athletes, they just don't like the taste of the caffeinated version of their sports
Yeah.
nutrition products. We're gonna dive down the individual rabbit hole because I know that's an area of passion for you, especially on the genetic side. But I've got a pretty hilarious story about this that I think will dovetail into it pretty nicely, and it has to do with the maximum dosage. I was pacing somebody at the end of a 100-mile race several years ago, and the way the situation was is there was only two people ahead of us on the course at the time, and I'm running alongside with my runner, and I find a one of those blister packets of, is either no dose or Vivarin, I can't remember right now. I should be able to remember because one's white and one's yellow. Anyway,
Yeah.
I find a blister packet of one of those, and there were 6 unopened individual 200 milligram caffeine tablets.
Okay.
And I just knew, and I'm going to keep this anonymous because this person would appreciate that. I knew who had it ahead of me because they were a very habitual caffeine user. But the only thing that I could think of is it was the intent of that runner to take all of those, all 1,200
Ah,
milligrams, because they
right,
would not spare one extra ounce. There's no reason for them to
right.
have 6 and not just 2, right? I
Yeah,
knew I knew that the intent was to take all 6. And I remember looking at it and processing this whole story in my head at the time, knowing who it was and knowing this
yeah,
person was going to take all 6 and going, I'm really glad that I found all of these and not an arrhythmic runner another couple of miles down the trail because
yeah,
he or she had taken all of these. So your point of there's a maximum dose that we want to avoid, I think, is really well taken, because you can absolutely have a lot of negative effects for exceeding, and there's no positive effects for exceeding the 6
yeah,
milligrams per kilogram ratio.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Perhaps maybe you saved a life.
I didn't
Uh,
do anything. I just found it.
yeah, yeah. Well, no, you picked it up. You didn't run after them and give it back, right?
No, I kept them. I showed them afterwards. I was like, "You were going to take all these, weren't you?" And this person was like, "Yeah, I was." I'm like, "I'm glad you
Yeah.
did." And so I gave him the lecture.
So how
Um,
did they do in the race?
I can't tell because it would give it away.
Oh, okay. Well, perhaps they didn't need it.
Yeah, yeah, they
Yeah,
definitely did.
interesting.
They did well. Let's put it that way.
Okay, okay.
That definitely did not hamper them that they dropped this.
Yeah, okay. Well, there you go. That was
Yeah.
an important lesson for them, I hope.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, you probably didn't
Yeah,
listen to me at the end of the day. Okay, we've dabbled around the surface of this kind of final component that I want to talk about, but I really want to relay this to the listeners as well. We're starting to appreciate more and more that there are these individual variances in people's tolerance and the way that they are affected by caffeine. And you mentioned that there's could it's either going to be environment or genetics or the confluence of these two. A lot of hype gets put on the genetic piece of it. I've had a genetic test. I know that I'm a slow metabolizer, so I shouldn't be drinking caffeine in the afternoon, which I still like to do. but
right.
but a lot of people are going to be familiar with just getting an over-the-counter direct-to-consumer genetic test that can determine this. Before we dive into that, like, paint the whole landscape in as briefly as you can of this
Sure,
individual variability in terms of how caffeine affects people.
sure. Well, there's the genetic component, of course, but I'll just list a few other areas to consider. That is the training status. So the research is mixed, but that may play a role, whether you're a trained athlete or not as well trained. If you're caffeine naive, meaning you don't use caffeine regularly, you may have a greater response. But on the flip side, being a frequent user doesn't necessarily impair that enhancement. So I think the research is really leaning toward the side that habitual users can get just as much of an effect. So I don't think we have to worry. And I certainly would not advise that someone take, and I get this question all the time, should I take a week or two or a month off caffeine in order for during my competitive phase or, in season to get the most benefit? Well, you may lose out on some important training adaptations in that 2, 3, 4 week period. So certainly if caffeine is something that's benefiting you in training and in competition, you really don't want to give up those weeks of not having as high of a quality of training session. We also need to consider, and this is related to genetics, some individuals have a greater withdrawal effect than others. So we see through research that have been associated to certain genes as well. We haven't done necessarily interventions on this, but we do know with questionnaires that some can skip 3 days of using caffeine and they're fine. They can, I'll have a coffee this morning. I won't have a coffee for the next 3 mornings. Doesn't really affect me too much. Others can have severe migraines, severe fatigue. So when we look at research where they've only abstained from caffeine for 24 hours, that's where we may not see that true performance enhancement. And maybe falsely we think there was a benefit, only because it's bringing them out of that withdrawal. So if I'm feeling awful and tired because I'm having this withdrawal effect and you give me some caffeine, I might perform better, but it wasn't really better, due to the caffeine. It just brought me out of withdrawal. So that's something to consider.
That's something that used to be de facto practice. And you remember this, where we used to take people off of caffeine before their critical event or whatever. And we ended up screwing them up more than more than actually helping them.
Exactly.
That's why I do not advocate for that, for athletes to abstain from caffeine for the 1 to 2 weeks before an event, because it typically has more negative effects, or it can have more negative effects than positive effects at the end of the day. I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah. No, for sure. We don't want to sort of get someone, sort of off their program mentally and physically.
Right.
And especially when we're dealing with something that is a psychoactive substance. And we want to keep the mind clear and focused. And so I don't advise changing up much of anything in your few weeks before your event, including diet. I mean, if you taper down your training, your glycogen is obviously going to be at a higher level if you're not expending as much, but otherwise you sort of don't want to rock the boat. So now when it comes to genetics, so when I began my research, I guess we're looking at 8 years ago now, when I started my PhD, the first study that did look at genetic differences was Christopher Womack, and he did find that when looking at one gene, the CYP1A2 gene, which is part of the P450 enzyme sort of pathway within your liver that detoxes various substances, including caffeine. So this identifies an individual as a fast metabolizer of caffeine, they break it down quickly, or a slow metabolizer. And then we do see a third genotype, which is what we label as an ultra slow metabolizer. Now, most studies combine those slow metabolizers, so they're not seeing perhaps a true effect of the ultra slow individuals, which is what my study did. I did find that there was a difference in performance between the fast metabolizers, or AA genotype. The heterozygotes really had not much of an effect. Some had a small improvement, some had a small impairment. But then it was that third group, unfortunately only 8 participants. So I only had 8 athletes with that genotype, which is typical of the frequency we see in the population is around 10%. But I had over 100 athletes, yet only 8 of the athletes were of that ultra slow metabolizing genotype. So that really is not allowing us to conclude much. It needed to be replicated, but unfortunately, the studies that have come after some of them have shown that the fast metabolizers are, I think in all but one study, do appear to perform the same or better. So it's always been those fast metabolizers that are likely getting more of an ergogenic benefit. Now, when those groups are combined and we don't see that there's an impairment, to me, it's those smaller studies where maybe there's only one ultra slow metabolizer, 1 or 2. And so we don't have enough of a sample size to replicate what I found. So I think what we do need is a study where we have 50 perhaps in each genotype. We need a larger sample size in that ultra slow metabolizing group. Now we have, there was a recent study showing with a caffeine mouth rinse that out of 10 subjects that they recruited, 9 of them were actually in this ultra slow genotype, which is interesting. And one was a heterozygote. And so just a regular slow, not ultra slow. And this is a group out of Brazil. And so I've asked the authors, of course, are you sure you found 9 slow metabolizers or ultra slow? Because that's not the usual, but there certainly did. It could be the ethnic background in that population, but they did not have a benefit from this caffeine mouth rinse. So I would say that we definitely can't conclude for sure. We know there are differences, but certainly what I advise to athletes is that if you're a fast metabolizer and you want to perform better in your sport, I would advise that you do try caffeine. Now, if you are a slow metabolizer, either the moderately slow or ultra slow, I would monitor your performance and I would try some workouts or some races. I mean, of course, try it in training without caffeine and see how you do. And I do have a couple of anecdotes, of course. And I did have one runner that had been a runner, 10K runner for over probably 12, 15 years and had always used caffeine. His genotype was that ultra slow metabolizer. And I said, you know what, just try some runs without caffeine, see how it goes. He was convinced that he was not going to perform better. So he ended up doing 10 runs without caffeine because each time he was surprised that he was actually performing the same. Then 2 out of those 10 actually were a personal best for him. And so he couldn't believe it because he didn't have that, and this brings us to another point, he didn't have that sort of mental jacked up beast mode, which I see also in some of my unpublished research, that just because you're feeling mentally jacked up, it doesn't mean that you're going to perform better. So there can be a mismatch there, because in my RCT, some athletes that said they felt jittery, but they also felt more energetic, that they actually performed better on the placebo trial in the cycling time trial than on the caffeinated trials. So what that tells us is that even though you're feeling stimulated, you're feeling more energetic, that does not necessarily translate into better physical performance. Right. But perhaps if you need to be awake, but not physically acting, so if it's purely a cognitive setting, maybe our recommendations will differ. So that's one aspect of, so the CYP1A2 gene. We also have the ADORA gene, and that, so I have a paper that will be published shortly looking at this gene, and I am not seeing a benefit with this gene as far as endurance performance. And we've seen mixed results in the literature in some other studies, including one out of our lab with strength and power, that there may be an effect with the CYP1A2 gene, but not necessarily with the ADORA gene. But what this ADORA gene is showing as that is performance related is the risk of experiencing feelings of anxiety. So we have the three genotypes. So this ADORA gene stands for adenosine. So it's the adenosine receptor gene. So the gene that's encoding the activity of that adenosine receptor. And remember, that's what caffeine blocks to give you that stimulating effect. So we do see that some individuals, the TT genotype, for those that are interested in the exact genetics, that they have a higher risk of feelings of anxiety. And this you can maybe override and still have a performance benefit. But for many athletes, this anxiety may hamper their performance. And certainly when we have sports where you need to be focused, concentrating, like going for 24 hours, or like shooting in the biathlon. Things like that. So the jittery or anxious. And then we have those that are associated with greater sleep disturbances. And so that's actually a study my colleague Amy Bender and I would like to do, is to see what athletes, and of course important for the military, who is well equipped to handle sleep deprivation and get the rescue from caffeine, and who is actually possibly dangerous without sleep. And the caffeine is not rescuing that stable cognitive, headspace to make the right decisions. And then that is going to translate to athletes. And she always argues, because she's a sleep scientist, sleep is the ergogenic aid. Getting your sleep is important. And, I was on the caffeine side, but I'm not really. I mean, I'm interested in the truth and the best for our athletes. But I just want to add one quick thing about sleep, is that many athletes or individuals will have caffeine later in the day and say, I have no problem falling asleep, and that's fine. But when we look at studies where we do the ECGs or the ECCs, is it EGGs? Just looking at the activity in the brain, it must be ECG. But there's a few of them. I know it's not EMG. No, that's the muscle. But looking into the brain, that they are actually not reaching that restorative sleep. So the depth of sleep to the same degree. And that's really important for glycogen resynthesis, muscle repair, immunity. So we have many factors that are, or many areas that are impaired with not having this restorative sleep. So even if you felt like you didn't wake up, caffeine is still negatively impacting your sleep. And so that's an important factor too, of taking it too close to bedtime.
Yeah, once again, this is going back to the original, or back to some of the initial part of the conversation, is I feel that caffeine, in the traditional ergogenic sense, where you're using it before a workout, can be a 1 up, 1 down, or maybe 1 up, 2 down, where the workout's a little bit better, but the sleep is worse. And sometimes the sleep being worse either counteracts the effect of caffeine, or is even counteracts it to a greater extent.
Your adaptations, not over time, you're not getting stronger. Perhaps you're not building more mitochondria. You're not getting that mitochondrial biogenesis, which is what we actually use caffeine for in fasted training. And we try and rescue those training sessions using caffeine without the fuel substrate in order to increase the mitochondrial biogenesis. And that's that approach of glycogen depleted training. And perhaps the caffeine is not allowing you to have those adaptations because the research is mixed. And that could be one aspect that has not been controlled for.
So many rabbit holes. Okay. You mentioned the fast metabolizers, the slow metabolizers, and the ultra slow metabolizers for the CYP12A gene. Roughly, what percentage of the population is going to fall into those categories?
Yeah, great question. 50% are fast metabolizers, 40% are slow, but the slow heterozygotes, about 10% are the ultra slow. So I would say with the heterozygotes, we still see some that are improving. Now, this could be the result of another gene. We published a paper on the HTR2A gene, which is serotonin receptor activity. So that was showing that if you're a fast metabolizer, having the CC genotype of this additional gene sort of reinforced the fact that you're likely to benefit. So I think that why I say monitor is that there's not only one gene involved. We have multiple genes that could be working together, interacting, counteracting each other. So with those heterozygotes, I would say that still many of them will still improve performance. And so I don't think it's just 50% of people out there that will have an improvement. And if we look at sort of my raw numbers of individuals at that 4 milligram dose, 58 did better on the caffeine trial, 10 had really no change, and about 33 worsened. So I would say, as a generalization, what I see in the in my experience and in the literature, probably about you probably have about a 75% chance of having a benefit of caffeine as an endurance athlete. Considering if you didn't know your genotype. So there could be that 25% that's not getting much of a benefit, or possibly an impairment. But so if we look at being a fast metabolizer, or 20% of the heterozygotes, we have 50 plus 20, you have your 70%. So
the genes aren't automatically going to screw you. If you're a slow metabolizer or an ultra slow metabolizer, I think the listeners can take away two things from this. One, if you have had a genetic test, we're going to talk about that in a second, and you know that you're a slow metabolizer or an ultra slow metabolizer, you still could have some positive ergogenic effect from caffeine, and you're going to have to trial it because it's a multifactorial type of drug.
Yeah.
The second thing, and I have to mention this with our audience, is if you are in the slow or in the ultra slow category, or you think you're in the slow metabolizing or the ultra slow metabolizing category, that doesn't give you permission to take more.
Right.
More is not the answer here, right, Nanci?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's something that I would suggest playing around with, it would be taking it sooner. So perhaps take it 90 minutes before you start your run or your race. And those are studies that need to be done. I think we don't have enough research on the timing. So how much beforehand, how much during. I think we really need to sink our research teeth into that and see what are the differences with taking a small dose, 90 minutes before, and then another top-up dose maybe just before, in the middle of training, as we discussed. So I think what happens in research is, because the methods are done one way, we give 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass 60 minutes before the start of this exercise testing, and almost every research group tends to do that. So in my study, we had different timing because the exercise tests I did 4: strength, power, anaerobic, the Wingate, and the endurance cycling time trial. So some of them started at 30 minutes, 40 minutes. The cycling time trial started around 60 minutes. But we also had, so not only the timing beforehand, but that we need to consider, but the amounts at each of those intervals have not been, I don't think, researched consistently or enough.
I'm almost feeling like this is following the carbohydrate path, right? Where first we add in layers of, okay, we know this is the general range of carbohydrate for an endurance athlete. This is the range of carbohydrate intake we need to target for any endurance athlete. Here's what we need to do for an endurance activity that's higher intensity. Here's what we need to do for lower intensity. Here's what we need to do for this type of person, for that type of person. I almost feel like caffeine's kind of following that same, maybe like 5 or 7 years behind, that same kind of pathway where every few years we start to get a little bit more tailored recommendations.
Yeah, I agree. And we do know with the multiple transporters, that was quite a sort of some of those landmark papers just
Yep.
recognizing.
Yep.
And that is also genetics, because we have the genes that are encoding those GLUT2 receptors, and you may have a max capacity of how much glucose you can absorb. And having that, if you have a low cap, a low ceiling there, you would be an individual who may benefit by having more fructose or galactose, or so that's also where genes can play a role there. So I think I guess the exciting part of research, and not so much for athletes that want to know now exactly what to do, is there's no shortage of things to examine and investigate, and we're learning more with time. And but I think one thing that's consistent in our learning journey is that there are many factors, multiple layers of that individualization, and there are often questions that are not being asked of athletes that I think is important. And just as a quick example, I see a lot of team sports use caffeine in a way where somebody comes with the bottle, and each rugby player or basketball player gets their tablets. And there's not only the fact that it might not sit well with some athletes, but also the fact that there's a little bit of this club, this peer pressure. And if somebody says, no, I'm not going to take any, I see that also with my ordering plant-based meals or vegan meals. If you're not eating, the chicken or the chicken wings, or ordering the steak as part of a male team, it's risky. It's risky of being ostracized. And I think we need to sit down with our athletes and say, what are your barriers? How are you feeling? How are you sleeping? And I think that's going to be our path to success. That's the path to gold, is to consider perceived and real barriers, and that heart to heart. I can't emphasize enough of sitting down with an individual and looking them at the eye and saying, let's make you the best you. And how are we going to do this together as a team?
Nanci, I've had the exact same experience in consulting with some of the league sports teams, where you walk in and they have the exact same prescription laid out for the entire team. You're using the recommendation of caffeine, but we've had it in other, particularly nutrition for whatever reason,
Yeah.
elements. And I've always looked at the coach or the trainer, or whoever's prescribing that, and going, okay, would you tell everybody here to bench press 250 pounds?
Yeah.
Would you tell them all to squat 300 pounds, every single person on the whole team? No, of
Yeah.
course you wouldn't do that. So why are you doing that with this one recommendation?
Yeah.
And finally, for whatever reason, that kind of like makes the connection. So needless to say, with that, one of the things that you harped on is it's not just genetics,
Yeah.
and these direct to consumer genetic tests are really prevalent right now.
Yeah.
You can get them everywhere. You get them sent to your house, you spit in it, or you provide a small little droplet of blood, you send it back, and you get this whole portfolio of things depending upon the test that you're actually getting. And one of them, and it inevitably, is going to be this. Most of them are just dividing it into fast metabolizer, slow metabolizer, at least as far as I've seen. Has that been your experience as well on the caffeine side?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not making the third category, the third
Right.
nuance
That's
category.
correct. Yeah.
But I want to get your general thought on that. And you've already gone through the fact that that's just one part of the equation. But how useful can things like that be to tailor something like caffeine dose for an individual if they're out there and they don't really kind of know, they can't get a sense of how they feel on different dosages and things like that? Is that a reasonable option to try to like narrow down these broad recommendations to an individual?
By doing a genetic test,
Yeah.
you mean? Yeah. Um, I think one way that definitely is helpful is it is increasing awareness. So an athlete that is going to go out there and buy a test and read the results and sort of take note of how they're feeling and what the test says, I think that in itself is a good thing. Just like we say, when individuals journal food, they they are having greater awareness of what they're eating, or anyone who starts a diet, whether it's the appropriate diet for them, at least they have greater awareness of what they're ingesting. Now, I would say that we have to be careful of some of the direct-to-consumer tests out there, because some of the interpretations are not correct, such as caffeine sensitivity and the markers they're using for that. We don't really have a we don't have a test for caffeine sensitivity in that term. There isn't sort of a scientific definition for that. So we want to make sure they're using the gene that is associated with anxiety, or is it sleep disturbance? And we actually don't know. It's not consistent what genotype increases the risk of sleep disturbances, even though we have one, the ADORA gene, which does look at that. But we see that one study is sort of different from the other three. So I think we need more research in that area. The direct-to-consumer tests, disclaimer, I do work for a genetic testing company. I'm on the scientific advisory board of Nutrigenomics based in Toronto. So that's with an X, the company name, that we really are about the science, and that's all the lab does. This testing company is partnered with the University of Toronto. But what I do see is in some of these direct-to-consumer is that they're interpreting even science that we've published, they're interpreting it incorrectly. So giving the wrong advice. So I believe that going through a healthcare practitioner, and that's what we do with this company, but there's other companies out there, I would have that accountability that is resulting from you having to answer to the dietitian, nutritionist, whoever is collecting your saliva sample, doing the test, and going through the results with you, because I think it's easy to misunderstand the results. So
I'm 100% with you, Nancy. Here's my experience on that, just from the listener's perspective, and I don't mind mentioning this at all. So we had a product on Helix's marketplace. So Helix works, for the listeners that aren't familiar with all of these direct to consumer tests, Helix kind of works like the app store, where people can come in and kind of plug and play their different genetic things that they're pulling out of one sequence. So Helix, the company, will send somebody a test, they'll get sequenced, and they'll do anything from like, here's the type of wine that you're supposed to like, to, we had a health and fitness product on there and things like that. And I actually wrote the guidelines for what we called endurance DNA, which is kind of specifically tailored for endurance athletes. We worked with the scientific advisory board on, on Helix's side. Hey, you can write this, you can't write this, and things like that. I had to water it down. This is me writing it. I had to water it down so much. I didn't like what I was presenting in either case. A, because it was too watered down, and then B, because I didn't feel like it, provided any sort of value to the consumers. So at the end of the day, what I decided is we would rather pair it with a consultation with a coach who can actually look through it all in context with the training, in order to really provide some valuable insights, so as not to kind of like bastardize the research that's been done and create a really slick product. Now, the caveat to that is it's boring, right? It's a boring product, because you can't say, oh, well, you've got the blue gene, so you need to friggin' lift weights or whatever it is. Everybody wants that super simple answer.
Yeah, and I take issue with some of those recommendations, because there are too many variables, and I think it's really a disservice to the athlete. And what I say in giving lectures is your coach knows best how you should train compared to the current direct-to-consumer genetic tests currently available in the marketplace. So trust your coach, trust your own intuition, and don't start lifting heavier or doing more cardio because of a test. I think that can be some layer of information, but you don't want it to be the end all be all. You want to take information from a variety of sources. So perhaps your genetics, your blood work, your diet, your coach, yourself, especially with runners, you can feel a lot if you dial into your own intuition, I think is underrated.
Yeah.
So,
The
and
way that
things like,
way
yeah,
that I've always presented it is it can shade the prescription. Not
yeah,
should shade the
yeah,
prescription. It can shade the prescription because I've had, once again, personal experience. This is another rabbit hole. We're going to be on here for
yeah,
4 hours, Nanci. I've had the experience where I've had an athlete, really good athlete, really successful athlete, have a
yeah,
genetic test, get the results back. And had I known those results and followed what I was supposed to do
yeah,
based off of the test, I would have done something completely different. Yet I still did something different. And the athlete was really, 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 not just one, but several athletes, really successful.
yeah.
So I always throw out those like little shades of caution when these things kind of come back because like you said from the onset, it's genetics and environment that
Mhm,
impact you, and your genes aren't necessarily 100% of your destiny.
mhm. Yeah, and also that we have so many genes. I mean, there are millions of variations. I mean, you and I can differ in hundreds of thousands of areas, yet we're both human beings. And it's amazing that one letter that shows if you're a fast or slow metabolizer of caffeine, also one letter can determine if your hair is brown or blonde, or if your eyes are blue or brown. So I don't think we should dismiss some of these single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs when it's just one variant of one gene. But for most outcomes, if you look at VO2 max or strength or the ability to put on muscle mass, all of these involve thousands of genes.
Right.
So looking at one is not going to give us a complete answer. And if you think of looking at a genetic test and say, hey, you know what, that may influence my outcome or my training by 1%, but I can't forget that there's another 99% that I should be addressing at the same time, or perhaps more importantly, because I have better control over it. So I think if you could, understand 50 of your genes and you think of all of them put together, maybe can impact your performance or predict somewhat of your future ability by 5%. Sure, use that guidance. But it's also like supplements. You want to work with your foundation. Don't work with the supplement that might
Right.
give you
Right.
0.5% improvement. Unless you're deficient, some of these supplements or micronutrients are not going to make or break you. It's, are you hydrated? Are you getting enough carbohydrate? Start with those things that aren't as sexy, but that's how we build an athlete is going from the foundation up, and then
uh,
we add the sprinkles on the ends.
Too many rabbit holes.
Yeah,
I knew this was
we can
gonna
always
happen.
chat again.
I know. We'll bring you back on again. It was awesome. It took us a long time just to get this first one off the ground.
I
Maybe like
know, I
3 years
I'm
from
sorry.
now, we'll have another one. When you
Yeah.
can travel, I'll come up to Toronto and we'll do it in
Well, you
person
know what I
also.
would love to talk about is plant-based nutrition. So
Game
that is
on.
my new passion, and I would love to help runners learn more about how they can eat more plant-based or vegans. Be vegan. I'm disclaimer. I am vegan, but I'm also a messenger of the research, and I'm doing a bit of research in this area now. And I think it's really important, especially for those that are feeling concerns for the treatment of animals, the environment, and many that feel that for their mental health, they want to make this switch. And how can we do that and still have them perform optimally? Because it's not just about your physical health and the macronutrients, but it's overall your philosophy for life. And what really plays a big role in that is how you are eating and interacting with the planet and with others. And so I think this is an area of extreme growth in the next several years. And I'm really excited to be part of helping with that direction of those that want to still be able to perform their best. And we have some exciting research coming out.
All right. Well, there you go. Open invitation. You get to come back on and talk about that. That was my very first podcast, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. We had vegans versus the omnivores or something like that. It was
Oh
right
yeah.
around the game changers, and I was totally taking
Oh
advantage of all the
yeah.
hype. You know how that goes.
Yeah, the game changers, that's something, yeah, dismantling that. But there's two sides to that story.
Totally.
Absolutely. I
Totally.
mean, I am shocked of the amount of people that came out of the woodwork to slam that movie. And it's like, relax. No one is going to take away your steak. It was just that was, I mean, never in history, I don't think if we had so many athletes come to their coaches, sports nutritionists and say, oh my gosh, should I go vegan or what am I missing? And that really caused some major waves, some tsunamis, I would say.
It was an interesting catalyst. I totally get you, because it had the right combination of timing, really slick production, an intriguing storyline, and it polarized kind of both sides of the argument, I think, in an equal and opposing fashion. And
Yeah.
it elevated the stature of the movie because of that. Well, all of which was
Yeah.
intentional. I mean, yeah, Hollywood people behind it, they know how to push people's
Yeah.
buttons.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll bring you back on, Nanci. Absolutely.
Yeah. Sounds
100%.
good.
We'll talk about it. Really quick, tell people where they can find you, and particularly your Twitter handle, because you were an awesome Twitter follow.
Oh, thanks, Jason.
You really are good.
Yeah, so my Twitter is Nanci with an I Guest, RD PhD, I believe is what it is. So Nanci Guest, RD PhD, and Nanci with an I. Yeah, there I want to do more on Instagram. It's a matter of time. So I'm not too active. I will more so on Instagram, and I want to try and add more science to Instagram, but certainly on Twitter. And I do interact with a lot of people. And the one thing I do like about Twitter is that you can have discussions and you can have multiple conversations. And I think that's really important, to have some of this important scientific discourse and to have disagreements and opinions and talk about a study. And you just can't have those same kind of discussions on Instagram and the same number of people participating. So, and I do answer questions. If someone responds to one of my tweets, I do my best to answer everybody. So that's also a way of capturing me, and asking questions.
Go follow Nanci on Twitter. You won't be disappointed. She does
Aw,
engage.
thank you.
Yeah, you do engage very well, Nanci. You do it in a respectful and intriguing way, one that's entertaining as well. I always appreciate it. I lurk way more than I comment, just because it's fun. But anyway, go give Nanci a follow. Anything else you want to plug, Nanci, before we go?
No, I just, well, one, I hope the Olympics is a success. My heart really goes out to athletes that have been training for Tokyo and what's happened. But everyone, be safe out there, and things are going to get better. And yeah, I think if you look at the Roaring 20s, after the Spanish flu, of course, in 1918, I think we're really in for a lot of activity out there, a lot of events, and I think we have a lot to be excited about. And certainly that's going to happen in the sport community. So people just hang in there, and a lot will be happening. So take this time to listen to your podcast, because otherwise you're going to be out in the world, doing stuff. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Jason. We'll talk again.
Thanks, Nanci. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go, Nanci. We will absolutely take you back up on the offer to come back on the podcast and talk all about plant-based nutrition. I know it's something that you're really passionate about. Listeners, go follow Nanci on Twitter. It is worth your time. It is really fun. And I guarantee you will learn something along the way. Thank you, Nanci, for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate it. The listeners appreciate it as well. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners. Thank you, guys. You are what really makes this podcast. That's it for now, people. As always, we will see you out on the trails.